Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, exploring Plato's Republic, we will offer an important window into reading that great text by understanding the basics of Platonic irony and how Plato uses irony in the Republic. What is Platonic irony? When reading Plato's dialogues, philosophers are often keen to highlight irony that occurs within his texts. Irony, however, is not necessarily what we think of it today. Rather, Platonic irony is carefully constructed and inserted into the text by Plato himself. Platonic irony is deeply dialectical in the Socratic sense, since Plato's literary and philosophical irony is generally found in the dialogue partner of Socrates. While Socrates does not always get the upper hand against his opponents in all of the dialogues, and while he is also silent or altogether absent in other dialogues, like the Laws, it is generally the case that Plato uses literary irony between the two main dialogue partners. Keeping with Socrates, because he is the main dialogue character in the Republic, we know that Socrates is wise, well-informed, and generally the sharpest of the minds within all of Plato's works, and especially here in the Republic. We expect Socrates to do well as the dialogue unfolds after having been introduced to him. Given Socrates' high reputation we have to him as readers, but also Socrates' high reputation in ancient Athens, there is a certain irony that lesser minds, the sophists, constantly get drawn into discussion and debate with him, where they are exposed for fools and deviants, fraudulent intellectuals who are really not that intelligent. Irony in Plato's dialogues is something missing in most English readings of Plato, in part because of the language barrier between English and Greek speakers. Prior to the 20th century, most readers of Plato had to read the Platonic works in Greek. This meant a mastery of the ancient Greek language. Today, with so many things translated, we can take the easy way out and not need to know the ancient Greek language in order to read Plato. And, in fact, I would say that we don't need to have a knowledge of Greek necessarily in order to pick up on irony, especially if you are taught by a good teacher. Hopefully, in this episode, I will be able to share with you a way to read Plato in English and to gain a deeper appreciation of the irony contained in the texts. To highlight Platonic irony, I will use three examples from the Republic, the most famous incidences in the course of the dialogue. Platonic irony is literary, but with philosophical consequences. The first example of irony in the Republic is in the character of Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is one of the more memorable, if not the most memorable, of the sophists that Socrates engages in the dialogue. Yet he only has a small speaking role in comparison to Glaucon and Adimantus. The name Thrasymachus means fierce or wild man, a savage fighter. The implication being Thrasymachus is a savage beast, a brute, a person who is not really human. While knowledge of what Thrasymachus' name means in Greek is useful to discovering and understanding irony, you will be able to see the irony of Thrasymachus, not only because you now know what his name means, but how Plato crafts the narrative, even in our English translations. When we first encounter Thrasymachus, Plato, through Socrates, describes him with very interesting language. Quote, coiled up like a wild beast about to spring, and he hurled himself at us as if to tear us to pieces. The description of Thrasymachus is that of a predatory animal, and it is meant to convey literary irony given his name and the manner in which he is described and how he acts and his ultimate thesis of justice in the dialogue. He is met as a beast, a brute, a savage. Furthermore, Thrasymachus's speech is short and ineloquent, also reflective of his brutish nature. Lastly, and this should be no surprise now, Thrasymachus's thesis on justice, that is, in the interest of the stronger, is also savage. Thrasymachus, the animalistic brute that he is introduced to us in the dialogue like a predatory animal who pounces and startles Socrates and Polemarchus. He speaks ineloquently and very savagely, in contrast to the soothing and eloquent speech of Socrates. And his thesis on justice embodies an animalistic, savage nature. So while you now know that Thrasymachus's name means savage beast or warrior, you can go back and read the Republic and pick up on the irony even without knowing Thrasymachus's name. For we are introduced to him as a coiled up beast ready to spring. We know that there is something odd about Thrasymachus. His speech is always short, brutish, and ineloquent. Again, something disturbs us in comparison to the eloquence of Socrates. And finally, when Thrasymachus gives his thesis on justice, he fully reveals his savage nature by saying justice is whatever is in the interest of the stronger. There is a further irony given Thrasymachus's animalistic and wild nature insofar that he encounters the civilized man, Socrates, and is subsequently pacified. We never learn if Thrasymachus really agrees with Socrates on the nature of justice, but Socrates does defend Thrasymachus against Adimantus as if he has become his domesticated pet. There's a certain irony here. As Plato writes through Socrates, quote, "Don't slander Thrasymachus and me, just as we've become friends. How is chaos and disorder brought into order, and how is something feral and savage domesticated and made acceptable to be around? Through the logos, through rational speech, which is embodied and exemplified best in Socrates." Another example of Platonic irony through names is the conversations between Socrates and Glaucon. Glaucon in Greek means gray-eyed. The owl is the wisest of all birds in traditional folklore because owls live long. And the most famous owl in ancient Athens had gray eyes because it had the same eyes as Athena. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, is often imagined as having an owl on her shoulder or nearby to indicate her wisdom. Through the name Glaucon, Glaucon's name literally invokes the goddess of wisdom, and that he should be a wise individual. The reality, of course, is the opposite. Glaucon is not wise at all. And even if you don't know that his name means gray-eyed, evoking the owl of Athena, if you read Glaucon's own statements and dialogue conversation, you will realize that he is not wise. He is, in fact, worse than Thrasymachus in many ways, as he becomes the main dialogue partner, because we see just how unwise and how cruel Glaucon is. Glaucon is set up, ironically, much like Thrasymachus. For those who would have known the Greek language, they would have been introduced to Glaucon as a wise character by his name alone, as we've just mentioned. But as the dialogue unfolds, Glaucon's positions become less the reflection of wisdom and more the boastful expressions of opinionated ignorance. And yet, Glaucon does show moments of wisdom if he is willing to learn and listen from Socrates. Thus, we see the irony in Glaucon. He is supposedly a wise man, yet he is drawn into a conversation with the real wise man and exposed as a fool. If Glaucon was wise, he would have known that Socrates was wise and would have avoided getting into a conflict with the true philosopher of wisdom. Furthermore, all of the things that Glaucon says are savage and opinionated, showing that he isn't wise at all. Yet there is also an irony within Glaucon's supposed wisdom. If Glaucon is a wise man, he does show it, ironically, through the fact that he is engaging with Socrates, the wise man, to learn wisdom. Famously, as we approach the famous myth of the cave, Glaucon, who has now begun to attentively listen to Socrates rather than interject against him, recognizes that the people enslaved in the cave are depicted strangely, something that ought to make thinking individuals cast suspicion, just as what happens with him. Glaucon is onto the fact that the cave, tyrannical and ignorant as it is awfully similar to the world Glaucon is familiar with. Socrates does say in response that the cave and the people in it, quote, are us, end quote. Glaucon's moments of wisdom manifest themselves when he actually lives up to his nature, his name being an owl. The owl is wise because it has not only lived long, but because it quietly observes the world before it. Glaucon, ironically, finally lives up to his name by being like a real owl, observing and learning from Socrates. Thus, we have the metamorphosis of Glaucon in the text. Glaucon initially, even if you don't know his name evokes the owl of Athena, reveals him to be foolish and intemperate. Glaucon is constantly interjecting and battling Socrates in their early encounters. Over the course of these encounters, Glaucon's nature changes. He actually becomes wise toward the end of the dialogue when he recognizes that the people being described in the cave are like us. And we realize that at the end of the dialogue, Glaucon is no longer the feisty, combative, opinionated, foolish individual he was at the beginning. A final example of irony is how the sophists believe that they differ in their views of justice, but that they are all actually linked together. For example, the savage thesis given by Thrasymachus of the strong over the weak logically exhausts itself in those advantageous positions, taking advantage of those in insecure positions. This is what Glaucon's myth of the ring entails. If justice is injustice, as Glaucon argues, it is not that Glaucon disagrees with Thrasymachus, but that he ultimately agrees with Thrasymachus. He's just giving a different example. The difference is that Glaucon also takes the next logical step in following Thrasymachus's principle. The logic of the sophist rejecting any knowable truth and embracing a relativistic notion of justice naturally and logically leads to tyranny and ignorance, which is the world of the cave, and that is what the cave embodies first and foremost. We will do an episode on the cave and its political reality. Irony is a major literary and philosophical theme through Plato's many dialogues. They are also deeply important for us to recognize when reading the Republic, because it allows us to gain a greater appreciation of the text and to also learn the deeper meanings of what Plato is trying to communicate. Let us return to this theme of irony with the Sophists. We have mentioned how the Sophists consider themselves to be wise men, yet they aren't. Yet by being drawn into conversation with the wise man, Socrates, they do in fact become wise at the end of the Republic. Plato is suggesting here that we should not think of ourselves like the Sophists. It is dangerous to consider yourself so highly opinionated and full of yourself. It is dangerous to think that you have nothing to learn from others. Yet, the fool comes into an argument with the man of wisdom and knowledge, just as the Sophists do with Socrates. And in doing so, they are all ultimately transformed, and they embody some degree of wisdom that has rubbed off to them through their conversations with Socrates. There is also irony entailed here. How these foolish sophists, who thought they knew everything about the world, had their worldview shattered, but in having that worldview shattered, and by not trying to kill Socrates, but learn from him, they finally become wise men. Plato is telling this to us through the interactions of Plato and the Sophists. Most of us are, in fact, like Thrasymachus, like Adimantus, and like Glaucon. Yet when we actually engage in wisdom, we ourselves become wise.